I still remember the day Jaron said those words to me clearly. He stood right in the middle of the living room, arms crossed, wearing a confidence I had never once seen in all our years together. Get ready. My life is about to change, and you're not in my future. I froze, unable to say a word. Just a few seconds earlier, I had been folding the dark moss-green scarf Mr. Walter gave me the first time we met. I could still hear him saying, "This house is cold. Don't let yourself get cold with it." I never expected that after all those years I would truly end up cold, but not because of the house. That afternoon, I dragged my small suitcase down the apartment steps. The Cleveland air was biting, the wind slapping against my face, but the thing that made me shiver wasn't the weather. I only managed to grab the moss-green scarf and wrap it around my neck before stepping out of the door I once called home. I signed the divorce papers that very night. Everything happened so fast, I didn't even have time to feel sad. But then, 3 days later, inside the office of Harrington and Wells, right in front of me, Jaron got down on his knees. If someone had told me, I wouldn't have believed it. Yet it happened, right before my eyes. If you enjoy emotional, real-life stories, feel free to leave a greeting or subscribe so the channel has more motivation to share even more stories. Thank you for being here. Now let's begin. I was 31 and living in an old apartment building in Cleveland. Every morning of mine started the same. That day was no different. I woke up at 5:20 a.m. when it was still pitch dark outside. The building's heating system was weak, so the cold always crept into my room. The moment my feet touched the floor, I shivered. I looked for my indoor slippers, but the straps had worn out. My work shoes were by the door, their heels so worn down that every time I stepped into the elevator, they made a clicking sound. My hands were cracked from washing dishes and spending long hours at the computer. Near the window, the moss-green scarf still hung on the hook, something I always saw first thing when I opened my eyes. It was the gift Mr. Walter gave me the first time he visited. I remembered clearly how he placed it in my hands and said, "This house is really cold. Don't let yourself get cold too." For some reason, every time I looked at it, I felt like someone still cared about me. I took a breath and got up to start a new day, a day just like hundreds of days before it. At 7, I arrived at the Cleveland Community Wellness Center and sat down at my familiar reception desk. My job was to greet patients, schedule appointments, answer phone calls, print documents, and prepare files. Everything repeated day after day. But I still tried to smile at everyone because I knew they had their own worries too. After my shift ended in the afternoon, I rushed to buy some food and went home to turn on my computer for my second job, online bookkeeping for a service shop. I checked invoices, entered data, and reconciled records until nearly 11 p.m. There was a lot of work, but I needed the money to keep my life stable and to make up for Jaron's failed projects. My life back then was just a cycle of work, home, extra work, sleep, repeat. Jaron always said he was born to do something big. He wanted to start a company, become successful, and prove himself. It all sounded great, but in reality, during the years we were together, I witnessed a tech accessory shop fails a game console, repair project shut down an online consulting service no one hired, and several other ideas that fizzled out just as quickly. Every time a project collapsed, he would fall into silence, then irritation, and then jump into a new idea again. Once, in a rare moment, he told me that as a child, he was always compared to his cousin. "Ricky already has his own store. What about you?" That sentence became a shadow trailing after him throughout his childhood. I understood why he was so obsessed with success. It was just that he kept placing more and more of that burden on my shoulders. At first, it was just a few careless comments. However, it later became a habit of his. One day, I had just come home from work and hadn't even changed clothes yet. He looked at me and said very casually, "You dress like this and look completely outdated. In the future, when I'm successful, I'll need a wife who knows how to support me, not someone who only knows how to go to work and come home." Hearing things like that again and again, I eventually didn't know how to react. I just stayed quiet because arguing wouldn't solve anything. By day, he claimed he was busy discussing new projects, and by night he came home later and later. Sometimes he said he was staying at a friend's place to work. Sometimes his phone was off the entire evening. I didn't dare ask too many questions. I kept reminding myself he must really be busy, but I knew clearly. A distance was growing between us, slowly and silently. That evening, I cooked a simple meal, pan-seared chicken and some boiled vegetables. I thought that since Jaron had been stressed lately, I'd try to make things feel a bit warmer. I set the food on the table and was about to sit down when he looked at me for a long moment, then spoke as if he were giving an ordinary observation. "You should get back in shape. You've really let yourself go." I froze for a moment, not because the words were too harsh, but because of the way he said them, as if I were genuinely bothersome. My hand rested on the moss-green scarf draped over the back of the chair, tightening unconsciously. I forced a small smile to ease the mood. "I've just been really busy lately. I'm probably just tired." Jaron cut me off immediately. "Even busy women should know how to take care of themselves. You don't want me to be embarrassed in front of my friends, do you?" My throat tightened. For the rest of the meal, I barely said a word. Jaron kept scrolling on his phone, occasionally sighing dramatically like the whole world was against him. 2 days later, I came home from work and heard loud noises in the living room. When I walked in, papers were scattered across the floor, the laptop was propped upright on the table, and Jaron was standing with his hand pressed to his forehead. Before I could even speak, he pointed at the screen, frustration dripping from his voice. The investors pulled out, just a small group, but important ones. They said I'm not stable enough. He kicked the table leg lightly, then picked up a pile of documents and tossed them onto the couch. Stable? How is anyone supposed to be stable in a cramped house, with little money, listening to complaints every day? People judge based on appearances. I work nonstop and nobody understands that. I knelt down to gather the papers for him. "Maybe we can review the plan? Or get someone to give feedback?" Jaron spun around instantly. "You always act like you know everything, always telling me what I should or shouldn't do. I fail because this life holds me back, because I don't get real support." I stayed silent. I didn't know what else to say. In the days that followed, everything got worse. Every night, I sat at my desk, opened my laptop, and typed until almost midnight. The bookkeeping job had piled up. But I pushed through because I needed to cover the recent shortages. Meanwhile, Jaron blasted the TV in the living room. Sometimes he shouted at a basketball game, his voice echoing into the corner where I worked, making my head pound. Sometimes I said softly, "Can you turn it down a bit? I need to focus." He didn't even turn around. He just replied curtly, "If you drop one of your jobs, I'd be able to focus. I'm worrying about our future, and you're wasting time on little things." I stiffened. I didn't know when it happened, when my efforts became little things. I didn't realize that the money I brought home was helping both of us survive. Those nights dragged on, and each time I felt the distance between us widen a little more. That afternoon, I had just come home from work when Jaron's phone rang. I heard the faint voice of an older woman on the other end. When he hung up, his expression wasn't sorrowful like I expected. It was confusion mixed with a hint of tension. I walked closer. "What happened?" Jaron licked his lips, then said quickly, "My grandfather, Walter, passed away in Columbus this morning." I froze for a few seconds. I had only met him twice, but I remembered his tall figure and deep, warm voice clearly. "I'm really sorry. He was so kind," I said with complete sincerity. Jaron nodded slightly, but his face didn't look like someone grieving. He stared into the distance as if calculating something, so much so that the corner of his mouth twitched upward, a tiny involuntary smirk. That moment chilled me to the bone. A man had just died, and the grandson's first reaction wasn't sadness. I tightened my grip on the moss-green scarf in my hand. I wondered if my eyes were deceiving me. Not even 5 minutes later, Jaron pulled out his laptop and opened a series of search tabs. He typed, Columbus house prices, Ohio lakeside cabin prices, average savings of elderly people, common retirement stocks. I sat on the sofa, watching him scroll through numbers and charts. He didn't mention the funeral once. He didn't ask how the relatives in Columbus were doing. He didn't recall a single memory of his grandfather. All he did was calculate. A while later, he spoke as if delivering good news. He had a 2-story house, a lakeside cabin, and some savings accounts. If things are like I think, it's a decent amount. I turned my head slightly toward him. Are you sure everything will go to you? Who else would it go to? I'm his only grandson, Jaron said, voice full of certainty. He leaned back on the couch, arms crossed. Don't worry. When I'm wealthy, I need a wife who fits that lifestyle. Someone who knows how to step into that world. The last sentence hit me hard. He said it so seriously, like he was planning his new life, one I might not be a part of. I didn't respond. My chest felt heavier and heavier. While Jaron kept typing, I stood up and walked toward the window. In my hand was the moss-green scarf Mr. Walter had given me the first time I visited. I remembered that day so clearly. He looked at me, smiled gently, and draped the scarf around my neck. He said, "This house is cold. Don't let yourself get cold with it." Now, in our cramped apartment, I realized that maybe he hadn't been talking only about the weather. I squeezed the scarf in my hand. It suddenly felt heavier than ever. Not because of the yarn, but because of the loss right before my eyes. A man had just left this world, and his own grandson thought only of money. I stood there for a long time. Suddenly, it felt like the distance between me and Jaron was no longer just distance, but a gap, wide and cold. I didn't know where our future would lead, but in that moment, I understood one thing clearly. There were family values Jaron had never truly respected, and that realization hurt in a painfully quiet way. That morning, I woke up early like I always did. The air was still cold and the windows were fogged with condensation. I went to the kitchen to make coffee and saw Jaron already standing in front of the mirror, adjusting his shirt collar and carefully fixing his hair. I hadn't seen him put this much effort into his appearance in months. "When are you leaving?" I asked. "Now." He glanced quickly at his watch. Then he straightened his tie one more time, looking both nervous and confident. I felt a little confused. "Maybe I should go with you? At least you'd have someone by your side." Jaron turned to look at me as if I had just said something absurd. "No need. This has nothing to do with you." The short sentence was enough to make me stand still for a few seconds. He put on his coat, grabbed his car keys, and slammed the door shut. I stood in the quiet room, my hand resting on the moss-green scarf hanging beside the door. It was clear. I really wasn't part of the future he kept talking about. Jaron returned close to 8 that night. I heard the door open, the sound of a paper bag hitting the table. When I stepped out, I saw a pile of documents already arranged neatly on the dining table. A simple divorce file, completely filled out, except for the space where I needed to sign. He stood next to the table with his arms crossed. His voice was so calm it didn't sound like him at all. "It's better to end this early. I have a lot to prepare. Go ahead and sign." I looked down at the papers. By the door, I saw 2 large bags of my things already packed. Clothes, personal items, and a few books. Everything was placed neatly next to the small suitcase I usually took with me on short trips. I asked softly, even though I already knew the answer. "You want me to leave right now?" "The sooner the better," he replied, without even looking at me. The air in the room was suffocatingly cold. I felt like a tenant whose lease had expired, not someone who'd spent 5 years by his side. I went into the bedroom for a moment to collect myself. When I came back out, I held the moss-green scarf. I wrapped it around my neck, tightening the ends. It was the only thing that made me feel even a little warm amid the emptiness before me. I pulled my suitcase toward the door. Each roll of the wheels on the floor sounded painfully loud, as if marking every step of a heavy goodbye. Jaren opened the door for me without saying a word. No apology, no explanation. I stepped out of the apartment and he leaned against the door frame, not even looking after me. I pulled the scarf tighter around my neck. It was the last shield I had to keep myself from trembling. I called Tessa, my best friend for more than 10 years. All I said was, "Tess, I need a place to stay." And she went silent for 3 seconds before saying, "Come here right now, I'm waiting at the door." When the rideshare car stopped in front of her building, I stepped out, dragging my suitcase, eyes burning. The door on the 3rd floor swung open, and Tessa ran out. Hair hastily tied, oversized sweater, moisturizer still smudged on her face. She hugged me tightly, and just that was enough to break whatever strength I had left. I didn't list Jaren's faults, didn't rant, didn't complain. I only managed one trembling sentence. He kicked me out. Tessa held me even tighter, brought me inside, and closed the door. She spoke softly. "It's okay, Malia. Stay here. Talk when you're ready." I nodded, my eyes red. I didn't blame anyone, not even myself. I just felt tired and cold. I sat on Tessa's sofa, pulling the moss-green scarf close to my body. For the first time in months, I let myself cry without holding back. 3 days after I left that apartment, my life passed so quietly it surprised even me. I went to work, returned to Tessa's place, ate a little, showered, then slept. Everything happened like a pre-programmed routine. I didn't cry anymore, and I didn't overthink. My body was so exhausted that the moment I lay down on the sofa, I fell asleep. Tessa didn't push me to talk, and she didn't ask questions. She simply kept warm tea ready, placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed, and occasionally put a hand on my shoulder just to make sure I was okay. One evening, when I folded the moss-green scarf and set it on the nightstand, I suddenly remembered the first time Mr. Walter met me. It was late autumn when he came to Cleveland. Cold winds swept through the hallway of the shabby apartment building. The moment he stepped through the door, he saw me shivering slightly from the draft. He took off the scarf from his own neck and placed it in my hands. "Keep this," he said, his voice slow but warm. "It's cold here." I remembered blushing, insisting I was fine, but he didn't listen. He gently wrapped the scarf around my neck like a grandfather caring for his granddaughter. I never imagined that years later, that small gift would be the only thing that made me feel like I still had something to hold on to. During those 3 days, I didn't receive a single message or call from Jaren. No apology, no concern. Through what Tessa heard from a few acquaintances, I learned that he had finalized the divorce paperwork the very next day. He even bragged to people that the lawyer said the will reading would be held the following week. He said confidently, "Next week my life will change. I'm going to level up." Hearing those words again, all I felt was emptiness. No anger, no resentment, just emptiness. Maybe when someone is hurt past a certain point, the emotions simply shut off. On the 4th morning, I was standing in the break room at the wellness center when my phone rang. A strange number appeared on the screen. I answered. On the other end was a middle-aged male voice, clear and professional. "Hello, is this Ms. Malia Parker? I'm Jonas Bright, representing the law office of Harrington and Wells in Columbus." My heart skipped a beat. I stumbled over my words. "Yes, speaking. What is this about?" Mr. Jonas replied in a serious tone. "We need you to come to our office to discuss certain matters related to the estate of Mr. Walter Hale." I jolted. What does that have to do with me? I'm just Jaren's ex-wife. We're divorced." There was a brief silence before he answered. "That is precisely why we need you to come. This is an important matter. We would appreciate it if you could be here at 5 p.m. today." I stood still, gripping the phone. "Yes, I'll be there." When the call ended, I looked down at the moss-green scarf lying in my locker. A cold shiver ran down my spine. Not from the weather, but from the feeling that everything was about to change in a way I had never imagined. I arrived at Harrington and Wells at 5:05 p.m. The Columbus sky was lightly gray, and the waiting room smelled of old wood mixed with fresh paperwork, which made me a bit nervous. When the assistant opened the door to lead me in, I saw Geron already sitting there. He wore a nearly new dress shirt, his shoulders slightly tense, eyes fixed on his phone screen as if he didn't want to meet me. Beside him was Aunt Clara, Jaren's grandmother's sister, a gentle woman who loved Mr. Walter very much. She stood up and took my hand. "You're here, dear. Sit here, don't worry." I nodded and sat in the chair opposite the lawyer's desk. My hands were in my lap, clutching the moss-green scarf, lightly twisting its edge every time my heart beat fast. Attorney Jonas Bright adjusted the documents and spoke in a deep, clear voice. "We will now begin reading the full contents of Mr. Walter Hale's will." I took a deep breath. I had no idea what awaited me. The lawyer opened the file. He read slowly, line by line. Mr. Walter's assets included a 2-story house in Columbus, a lakeside cabin on Ontario Creek, 2 savings accounts, a portfolio of valuable stocks, and several smaller holdings. The total estimated value, $1.8 million. I felt dizzy. I had never imagined he would leave such a large estate. The lawyer looked up and then read the crucial clause. "I leave the entirety of these assets to my grandson, Jaren Hale, but only if he maintains a lawful marriage with his wife, Malia Parker, continuously for at least 14 months from the date of my death." No one said a word. I held my breath. Mr. Jonas continued, "If the marriage is terminated before that period, for any reason, the entire estate will belong to Malia Parker." My eyes widened. Jaren turned to look at me, his face drained of color as if the blood had been sucked out. The lawyer closed the will. "You divorced 2 days after Mr. Walter's passing. Therefore, under the terms of the testator, the entire estate transfers to Ms. Malia Parker." The room fell into absolute silence. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Aunt Clara sighed, leaned her hands on her knees, and said, "Walter did not do this carelessly." Attorney Jonas nodded and took out a note attached to the will. "Mr. Walter told me that. He once visited Cleveland 2 years ago." I remembered that visit. He stayed for 2 days. I cooked dinner and made tea for him, while Jaren was busy with a new project. The lawyer read slowly. "I observed how my grandson treated his wife. The girl is kind and hard-working, but she is belittled in her own home. If one day she must suffer, I want life to return to her what she deserves." I choked when I heard the line, "She has a beautiful heart." Aunt Clara looked at me with sad eyes. "He told me that about you, Malia." I bowed my head and tightened my grip on the moss-green scarf. I never expected that brief meeting would become the reason my whole life changed. Suddenly, Jaren sprang up. "No, this can't be. This is my family's property. I'm his blood grandson." His voice trembled. The lawyer replied calmly, "Mr. Walter had the right to decide, and he decided." Jaren turned toward me. His eyes were red, his lips trembling. Then, right in front of me, he dropped to his knees. His knees hit the floor with a small thud. I was startled. "Malia, I'm sorry. I was wrong. I was hot-headed, impulsive. Come back to me? Let's start over. I swear I will change. Just say yes." His mouth mouthed apologies, but his gaze was fixed on the file of assets on the desk. I could see it clearly. He wasn't crying because he'd lost me. He was crying because he'd lost $1.8 million. The moment I realized that, my heart closed completely. I placed the moss-green scarf lightly on my lap to calm myself. I straightened and looked at him, speaking in a clear voice. Steady, not trembling, not angry. "Jaren, there is nothing left between us to mend." He choked out. "Malia, don't say that. We lived together for 5 years." I shook my head. In those 5 years, you never really saw me. And today, on your knees like this, you still don't see me." He fell silent. The room grew quiet with him. I picked up the scarf, gripped its edge, and stood. It felt so clear. That chapter of my life had ended. The next day, I returned to Harrington and Wells to sign the formal paperwork. The conference room was the same, quiet, lit with soft yellow light, and a stack of documents to sign lay on the table. My hand trembled as I held the pen, not because of the money, but I never imagined my life could take such a strange turn. With each signature, I thought of Mr. Walter, his unhurried way of moving through the kitchen, the way he smiled when he watched me cook, and the moment he gave me the moss-green scarf. "It's cold here. Don't let yourself get cold with it." When I finished signing the last document, Aunt Clara came over and took my hand. Her hand was warm and steady. "Walter believed in kindness," she said slowly. "He believed that those who do not do evil will be rewarded by life. You deserve better things." I couldn't hold back the sting in my eyes. Perhaps for the first time in weeks, I felt a real sense of relief. That afternoon, I went to Mr. Walter's townhouse in Columbus. The key turned, the door opened, and the smell of old wood and books gently flowed in. The house was quiet and warm in a strange way. The worn but clean light wood floors, a large bookshelf taking up one wall, full of his books, a big armchair by the window, a brown-gray wool blanket folded on the chair. Everything was exactly as if he had just stepped out of the room. I strolled through the house, touching each item as I went. They weren't mine, but somehow I felt welcomed. I set my bag down, took the moss-green scarf off my neck, and gently laid it across the back of the armchair, like placing a greeting. A thank you to the man who had trusted me in a way I never expected. "I'm here, sir," I whispered. I spent several days cleaning, washing the windows, and rearranging the books. Then I did something I had wanted to do for a long time. I emailed to resign from the Cleveland Community Wellness Center. I also stopped the evening bookkeeping work. The next morning, I enrolled in an online French class and a painting class at a nearby center. I used to love drawing as a child, but life's busyness had made me stop without noticing. One particular afternoon stands out. I stepped onto the porch and wrapped the moss-green scarf around my neck. Sunlight filtered through the awning and a breeze blew just enough for me to feel like I could breathe. After years of pressure, criticism, and exhaustion, I realized I was truly free. No one shouted at me. No one told me I was not good enough. No one forced me to chase someone else's dream. It was just me and my own future. A few weeks later, after the inheritance matters were settled, I opened a new bank account and established a small fund called the Hale Women's Support Fund. I named it Hale to honor Mr. Walter. The fund focuses on helping women in hardship with divorce support, safe housing, legal fees, temporary work assistance. The first people who came to the fund were young women abandoned by their husbands, a single mother who lost her job, a woman fleeing domestic violence who needed temporary shelter. I met each person and listened to every story. One night, I sat with a young woman until 10 p.m., just so she could finish telling her heart. And I understood what Mr. Walter once believed. When you give kindness, life opens up in unexpected ways. Day by day, I was learning to become a better person, not because anyone forced me, but because I knew I had the chance to do the right thing. A new life truly began the moment I stepped into that house. It was a fabulous afternoon. I went into a small coffee shop in downtown Columbus, the one I usually visited after my art class. I chose a table near the window, ordered a cappuccino, and opened the book I'd been reading. I draped the moss-green scarf lightly over my shoulders. The weather wasn't that cold, but I still liked the familiar feeling the scarf gave me. As I turned a page, the door of the shop swung open. Someone walked in, and the sound of their shoes made me look up instinctively. I froze. Jaron. He stood there at the entrance. looking so worn out I almost didn't recognize him. He had lost weight, dark circles under his eyes, uneven stubble, a frayed jacket worn at the shoulders. Beside him was a young woman, maybe in her early 20s, heavily made up, complaining in a bored tone. "You promised to take me to a real restaurant. What is this cheap place?" Jaron answered in a small voice. I'm a bit short on money right now. Next time." Hearing that, I understood immediately. He had nothing left. No money, no real friends, no trace of the confidence that once made him hold his head so high he couldn't see anyone beneath him. No, me. They ordered 2 coffees. When he turned around, Jaron saw me. I saw him freeze in place, his body tilting slightly as if someone had pushed him back into an old memory. The young woman didn't notice and walked to an empty table. Jaron stood still for a moment before taking a few hesitant steps. Not too close, just enough for us to see each other clearly. His eyes no longer had that calculating look. They were empty and tired. For the first time since I had known him, I saw no reflection of money in his gaze. And then I saw something else, something I never thought I'd see one day. Real regret. I knew it the moment his eyes fell on the moss-green scarf on my shoulder. He blinked slowly, as if he'd just been pulled back through all the years. Maybe in that moment, in that tiny coffee shop, he remembered the things he had long forgotten. The night I brought him a hot meal when he stayed up preparing for his first pitch. The morning I washed his only dress shirt and blow-dried it right before his interview. The time I stood at the bus stop in the freezing cold, hands shaking from the wind, still smiling when he arrived late. The months I worked 2 jobs so he could focus on his startup. The way I believed in him, even when he didn't believe in himself. A flood of memories seemed to spill open. I saw it clearly in his eyes. A look that had never appeared once in the 5 years we were together. In that moment, Jaron finally understood the lesson I had been forced to learn through tears. He had lost the only person who had ever truly been by his side, and he had lost her forever. I knew he regretted it, but his regret arrived later than every door he had slammed in my face. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to say something, but I simply smiled gently. I didn't blame him. There was nothing left to say. I nodded, as if greeting an acquaintance, then returned to my book. I felt the moss-green scarf resting softly on my shoulders, warm, light, and peaceful. The young woman nudged him. "Are you coming to sit down? Why are you just standing there?" He turned away. His shoulders slumped slightly. I didn't look again. I didn't need to. My life had moved on, and the page of his life, he would have to read it on his own. I sipped my cappuccino, turned another page, and felt an unfamiliar calm settle inside me. Not because I was better than him, but because I was no longer the woman waiting for him to value me. In the warm little coffee shop, I knew I had finally stepped out of the past. That afternoon, I stood on the balcony of the townhouse in Columbus. The late sunlight fell across the rooftops, soft and warmer than I expected. The breeze drifted through the leaves, making a gentle rustling sound like a greeting from a peaceful neighborhood. I wrapped the moss-green scarf around my neck, the scarf Mr. Walter had once given me with those simple words, "It's cold here. Don't let yourself get cold with it." Now I understood that he hadn't been talking only about the weather. I looked up at the sky, pale blue mixed with orange, and whispered softly, just enough for myself to hear, "Thank you, Mr. Walter. I will live well." Warmth rose in my chest, not from the scarf, but from something more profound, like I was finally standing in a place that truly belonged to me. The past months have taught me something clear. Family is not just where we are born. It is where someone truly wants us to be at peace. Mr. Walter had appeared in my life only a few times, yet his kindness changed everything. I also realized respecting the elderly is respecting our own roots. They see things we often miss while rushing through life. Kindness is never wasted. Maybe it costs us in the moment, But someday, when we need it most, life brings it back to us. I had been mistreated and abandoned at my lowest point, but it didn't make me bitter. I chose to keep the kindness Mr. Walter believed in, and that choice opened a new path for me. If you're going through dark days, if you've been belittled, abandoned, or felt life was unfair, believe me, one day, light will find you too. Maybe in a way you never expected. Thank you for listening to my story until the end. If you see yourself in it or simply want to follow more stories, you can subscribe or leave a message. I'll meet you in the following story, another story about life, kindness, and the small things that can change a whole future. Thank you, truly.